The kettle had just finished boiling when my phone lit up on the bench. It was my solicitor. 7 in the morning. I knew then that today was going to be different. I set my mug down and answered. He didn't say much, just told me to wear the gray suit, arrive 15 minutes early, and not to react to anything I saw or heard until he gave me a nod. That was it. 3 instructions. I said I understood and hung up. I stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the garden. The cowhide was just coming into flower. Those little yellow bells hanging off the branches the way they do every September. My late mother used to say cowhide flowers meant something was about to change. I never believed that sort of thing. That morning I did. My name is not important for this story. What matters is that I spent 31 years building something. A business. A marriage. A life that, from the outside, looked exactly like what it was supposed to look like. A modest house in the Waikato, 2 adult children, a company that employed 23 people at its peak, and a wife I thought I knew as well as I knew myself. I was 62 years old, and I was about to walk into a courtroom and find out how wrong I had been. Let me go back to the beginning. I started my surveying firm in 1993 with a second-hand Transit and a ute that burned oil. My wife, I will call her my wife throughout this, because that is what she was. Even at the end, she was the one who kept the books in those early years. She had a good head for numbers, always had. We worked alongside each other for the better part of a decade before the business grew enough to bring in proper accounting staff. By the time our kids were teenagers, the firm had contracts with 2 regional councils and a handful of developers up and down the North Island. Nothing spectacular. Solid, careful, honest work. My wife eventually stepped back from the day-to-day. She said she wanted to focus on the children, and later on other things, a community board position, some volunteer work, a social life I was mostly too tired to share. I didn't question it. I was working 60-hour weeks. I trusted her completely. That trust, I would later understand, was the most expensive thing I ever owned. The first sign was small enough that I nearly missed it. About 4 years ago, I noticed an invoice for professional services that didn't match any supplier in our system. The amount was just under the threshold that would have triggered a secondary approval, $3,800. I flagged it to our accounts manager, a steady young woman named Priya who had been with us for 6 years. She looked into it, came back to me 2 days later with a slight frown, and said it appeared to have been processed through my wife's old access credentials, which should have been deactivated years prior. I told Priya to leave it with me. I didn't tell her anything else. That evening I did not mention it at dinner. I watched my wife talk about something she'd seen on television. I watched her pour herself a second glass of wine. I watched her hands, her eyes, the way she laughed. She looked completely comfortable. That unsettled me more than the invoice. I am a surveyor. My entire working life has been about reading land. You walk a boundary. You take your measurements. You mark what is true. What I have learned after 4 decades is that the most dangerous inaccuracies are not the obvious ones. They are the ones that sit just inside the margin of what looks acceptable. A small drift repeated consistently becomes a catastrophic error over distance. I started measuring. Over the following months, I went back through our personal accounts as far as I could access. I am not an accountant, but I know how to read a ledger. What I found was not dramatic. It was quiet and methodical and, in its own way, far more frightening than something dramatic would have been. Transfers to accounts I didn't recognize. Payments described as household expenses that bore no relation to anything I could identify. A pattern of withdrawals timed just before our quarterly reviews when my attention was most divided. Over 3 years, the figure I eventually arrived at was a little over $240,000. I sat with that number for a long time before I did anything with it. I did not confront her. I know that is what most people would have done, and I understand why. But I had spent 31 years beside this woman. I had held her hand when her mother died. I had sat beside her at 2 schools, 2 proms, 2 university graduation ceremonies. I needed to know the whole shape of the thing before I said a word. Because once I said a word, I would never be able to unsay it. I rang an old friend who had spent his career in financial forensics. He had retired up to the Bay of Plenty, growing tomatoes, and I had not spoken to him in 3 years. He listened to me on the phone for 20 minutes without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then said, "Send me what you've got. All of it. Don't touch anything else." I couriered him 4 folders the next morning. While he worked through the documents, I kept going to work. I came home for dinner. I asked my wife about her day. I listened to her talk about the community board, about a friend's grandchild, about a documentary she wanted to watch. I was present in every room and completely alone in every room at the same time. It was the loneliest 4 months of my life. My friend rang me on a Tuesday evening in March. I was still in the office, and I remember I had to close the door and stand at the window with the phone pressed to my ear because my hands were not entirely steady. He told me the picture was worse than I had described. The $240,000 I had identified was only part of it. When he traced the accounts properly, he found a structure, not a simple siphon, but a layered arrangement involving a financial advisor and what appeared to be a managed portfolio in my wife's name alone, funded from sources that traced back to our joint assets and, in 2 instances, 2 invoices from the business itself. He gave me a number. Just over $480,000 over approximately 4 years. I said nothing for a moment. He said, "Mate, you need a lawyer. Not just a divorce lawyer. A proper commercial litigation firm with fraud experience. Tonight, if you can." I thanked him. I hung up. I looked out at the Wellington lights through the rain-streaked glass. I was down for a council presentation that week, and I thought about my children. My son, who works in Christchurch. My daughter, who had recently moved back to Hamilton and was living 20 minutes from the house where she grew up. Neither of them knew anything. I intended to keep it that way for as long as possible. I rang the solicitor I knew from a property dispute years back. He listened, gave me the name of a firm in Auckland, and told me to ring them in the morning. I did. What followed was 7 months that I will not fully describe, partly because much of it is still subject to ongoing proceedings, and partly because it was the most methodical and painstaking period of my professional life, and I say professional deliberately, because that is exactly what I had to make it. I could not afford to feel it. Not yet. The lawyers worked with my friend's analysis. They brought in their own forensic accountant. They contacted the relevant financial regulatory bodies. They were careful and thorough, and they moved at a pace that I sometimes found agonizing, but which I came to understand was necessary. You do not build a case like a fence post, bang it in, and hope for the best. You build it like a survey. You take each measurement twice. You check your datum. You do not mark the boundary until you are certain. During those 7 months, my wife continued as normal. She was not entirely normal. There were moments of tension I attributed at first to ordinary marriage wear, the kind that accumulates over 3 decades. She was more careful with her phone than she used to be. She occasionally mentioned her financial advisor in conversation, which she had rarely done before, and I noticed she began referring to him by his first name, Philip, with a slight softness that had not been there previously. I noted it. I passed it on to the lawyers. I said nothing at home. In September, the lawyers told me we were ready. The civil action was prepared, the supporting evidence was documented, and the family law proceedings could be filed simultaneously. They advised me to speak to my children before the papers were served, if I felt I could do so without compromising the process. I drove to Christchurch to see my son on a Saturday. I took him for a walk along the Avon. We fed bread to the ducks the way we used to when he was a boy. I told him carefully, and as clearly as I could. He stopped walking. He looked at the water for a long time. Then he said, "How long have you known, Dad?" I told him. He put his arm around my shoulders, and I had to work fairly hard at that point to hold myself together. I rang my daughter on the drive home. That call was harder. She asked me 3 times if I was sure. I told her I was. She cried. I stayed on the phone with her for an hour, pulled over on the side of the road somewhere near Ashburton with the radio off and the paddocks dark on both sides. That was the hardest night of those 7 months. The papers were served on a Wednesday morning in October. I was not at the house when it happened. I was in the office, drinking tea that had gone cold, trying to read a site report that I kept having to restart from the beginning. At 9:47, my phone rang. It was my wife. I let it go to voicemail. She rang again. I let it go again. The 3rd time, I answered. Her voice was a register I had not heard before. Not angry. Not frightened exactly. Something between the two, with something else underneath it, a quality I can only describe as the sound of someone realizing they had miscalculated. She said she needed to talk to me. I said my lawyers would be in contact with her lawyers. She started to say something else, and I said, as quietly as I could, "Please don't ring me again on this number." And I ended the call. I sat at my desk for about 3 minutes. Then I went and made a fresh cup of tea, and I walked back to the site report. And this time, I managed to read it. The family court hearing was in November. I had known the date for 6 weeks. I had not told anyone outside the immediate legal team and my children. I had continued to come to work, continued to manage the firm, continued to be the person I had always been in every room I walked into. If anything, I think I was calmer during those weeks than I had been in years, because the uncertainty was over. I knew what was coming. I had done everything I could to prepare for it. All that remained was to show up and be steady. The morning of the hearing, I put on the gray suit. I drove into the city. I arrived 14 minutes early and waited in a small meeting room with my 2 lawyers and a paralegal who brought good coffee and said very little, which I appreciated. My wife arrived with her lawyer. She looked, as she had always looked, composed, well-dressed. She had always known how to present herself. That morning, she was wearing a coat I didn't recognize, a deep plum color, and small gold earrings that had been a 25th anniversary gift from me. I noticed both things, and then I looked at my hands and did not look at her again. Her lawyer had clearly told her this was going to go well for her. That is my reading of it now. She believed she had managed things well enough that the family law process would proceed in a straightforward manner, that what had been moved could not be easily traced, that what had been built could be dismantled before anyone looked closely enough. She had not accounted for $480,000 worth of forensic accounting. The hearing itself is a matter of record. I will not reproduce the legal proceedings in detail. What I will say is this. About 40 minutes in, when her counsel was presenting what he characterized as a complete picture of the marital assets, my lead lawyer set a bound document on the table. Not dramatically, not with any particular emphasis. He simply placed it there and said, in the same tone one might use to pass the salt, that there were some additional items he would like to bring to the court's attention. I had been told beforehand not to react. I looked at the table. I looked at my hands. I breathed. What followed was approximately 2 hours that I will not describe in detail. I will say that my wife's composed expression was the first thing to change. Then her lawyers. Then, about 90 minutes in, there was a recess during which I sat in the corridor on a wooden bench, and my senior lawyer sat beside me and said, with the smallest possible smile, "You can breathe now." I told him I was breathing. He said, "You know what I mean." I did. The civil fraud proceedings are ongoing. I cannot comment on those in detail. What I can say is that the financial advisor, Philip, has retained his own separate legal representation and that certain regulatory bodies have expressed an interest in his conduct that extends beyond my personal matter. I leave the implications of that where they sit. In the family proceedings, the outcome addressed the dissipation of assets in a manner that my lawyers had prepared me to expect, but which was, nonetheless, something I needed a day or two to fully absorb. The business was protected. The house my mother helped us choose, where I planted the cowhide in the back garden, where both my children grew up, was addressed in a way that allowed me to retain it. I am still in it. I had breakfast in that kitchen this morning. There are things I have thought about a great deal since all of this began. My son asked me once, somewhere in the middle of it, whether I wished I had confronted her sooner, directly, before any of the legal preparation. He was not criticizing me, he was genuinely asking, trying to understand. I thought about it for a while before I answered. I told him that I understood the impulse. There is something in a person that wants to confront a wrong the moment you see it, wants to name it, to put it on the table, and demand an explanation right then. I understand that. For most of my life I operated that way, and in most situations it served me well. But this was not most situations. And I told him that what I came to understand during those months was that confrontation in that kind of situation would have served me, and only me, in a very limited and very temporary way. It would have felt honest. It would have felt strong. And it would have cost me evidence, cost me time, cost me the ability to act from a position of complete preparation rather than complete surprise. Patience is not weakness. I want to be clear about that, because I think there is sometimes a suggestion, particularly aimed at men of my generation, that withholding a reaction is the same as failing to act. It is not. Choosing when to act, and how, and with what, in your hands when you do that, is not passivity. That is exactly what experience is supposed to teach you. My children taught me something during this too. My son drove up from Christchurch the week after the hearing, just to be there. My daughter came for dinner 3 nights that week. Neither of them asked many questions. They just showed up. I am still moved when I think about that. I am 63 now. I run the firm. Priya, my accounts manager, got a considerable bonus at Christmas, which she accepted with characteristic quiet dignity, and which she very much deserved. My friend in the Bay of Plenty came down to visit in January, and we drove out to the coast and ate fish and chips on the sea wall and talked about everything except what we had both spent the better part of 2 years dealing with. It was a very good afternoon. The cowhide is coming into flower again. There is something in that I am choosing not to read too much into, but I will say this. To whoever might be listening, the most valuable thing I did in those months was not the evidence gathering, as important as that was. It was not the legal preparation, as necessary as it was. The most valuable thing was the decision to slow down at the exact moment every instinct I had was telling me to move fast. To measure twice before I marked a single boundary. To make absolutely certain of the ground beneath my feet before I took a step I could not take back. I built a business for 31 years on that principle. I should have applied it to my personal life sooner. But I applied it when it mattered, and it held. If you are in a situation where someone you trusted has been quietly working against you, a spouse, a business partner, anyone, I would say this to you gently but plainly. Do not move until you can see the whole shape of what has been done. Document everything. Find the right professional help, not the first help available. Protect your children from the details for as long as you honestly can, and understand that steadiness in the face of betrayal is not the same as acceptance of it. You can be grieved and still be methodical. You can be hurt and still be precise. The land doesn't lie. If you measure carefully enough, the truth is always there to be found. I found mine. I have been asked a few times since all of this settled down whether I feel angry. Not at the time, people were careful about that during the worst of it, but now, with some distance. Whether the anger came eventually, honestly it did not. What came instead was something quieter and I think more useful. A kind of clarity about how things actually work between people and what happens over time when someone builds a life on a foundation that cannot hold its own weight. What my wife did was not a single decision. That is the part I have had to sit with. It was not one bad moment, one weak afternoon, one choice made under pressure. It was a long series of small choices, each one made in full knowledge of the previous one, each one slightly further from what is honest. 4 years of that. 4 years of sitting across the dinner table from me, talking about ordinary things, while quietly dismantling what we had built together. I do not say that with bitterness. I say it because I think it matters to understand. The consequence she eventually faced was not bad luck. It was the accumulated weight of $480,000 worth of decisions, finally arriving at once. That is how it tends to work. Not as punishment handed down from anywhere, simply as physics. Every structure built on false measurements eventually shows the error. It may take longer than seems fair. It often does. But the drift compounds, and one day the boundary does not sit where anyone thought it did, and then everything has to be resurveyed from scratch. Priya noticed the first invoice. One line, $3,800, sitting just inside the margin of what looked routine. She could easily have let it go. Most people would have. But she had the integrity to bring it to me, and that single act of professional honesty was what opened the door to everything that followed. I think about that sometimes. How much turns on someone simply doing their job with care and a straight eye. My friend in the Bay of Plenty gave up weeks of his retirement to go through 4 folders of financial documents for me. He did not have to. He asked for nothing. He just did it because it was the right thing to do for someone he trusted. That kind of loyalty, given quietly and without fuss, is rarer than most people think, and worth more than most people say. What I would want anyone to take from this, not as instruction, just as one older man's honest reflection, is that integrity is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It is mostly just the quiet habit of doing the accurate thing when no one would notice if you did not. My entire working life has been built on that principle. You measure correctly. You mark what is true. You do not adjust the numbers to suit what you hope to find. I did not always apply that to my personal life as carefully as I should have. But when it mattered most, I found I still knew how to do it. Slow down. Measure twice. Make sure of the ground before you step. The cowhide is flowering again. I had breakfast in my kitchen this morning. My daughter rang to say she is coming for Sunday lunch. That is enough. That is more than enough.